Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff, and this week I'm going to be making a Legend of Zelda themed diorama showing Link facing off with Shadow Link in the water temple. I was inspired by this model that I saw on a Facebook group, Miniature Painting Noobs. The artist Marzina has mirrored a model and used a dark and light colour scheme to show two sides of an opposing portal. I loved the way this looked, and the idea straight away struck in my mind to do this using Link and Shadow Link. It's also a perfect opportunity to play around with my first major resin pour. So as usual, I jumped over to Thingiverse and found myself a model of Link from The Legend of Zelda. I downloaded this and threw it into Chitterbox, where I scaled him down and then made a duplicate copy and mirrored it on the Y-axis, so that the two are facing down and mirroring one another. I then printed this off along with a couple of spares in case something went wrong with the print, as well as a pile of rupees that I'll never end up using. I gave him the usual prime in a cheap grey primer before giving him a zenithal highlight with a wraithbone white from Citadel. And now it was time to paint the models up. I decided to start with Dark Link as he was going to have a much more simple colour palette. Although this was my first time painting a black and white miniature, so it was interesting using a heap of different shades of black. I started by bulking him out with the contrast black, and then coming in with a thicker Abaddon black over all of the skin, before using a black leather for all of the leather pouches and straps. I then used a basilicanum grey over all of the white clothing to darken it up. Now to add the glowing red eyes, I gave a nice big blotch of white and then cleaned up the edges, before coming in with the Citadel Technical Spirit Stone Red to add some nice shining glazed red eyes. And then deciding to paint the hair white, as a lot of the artwork of Shadow Link has this nice bright white hair that I really feel makes him pop. And then moving on to the regular Link, which will start with a lot of different greens, playing around with both the speed paint green and the Citadel contrast green. I then used a Agaros Dunes for the hair, and then moved on to a few of the brown leather details with a snakebite leather from Citadel. Now using a Cygor fur for the larger leather parts of armor, and then a nice silver base for anywhere that we want that nice metallic sheen. Now I'm going to pull out this old metallic blue model paint that I've got for the shield and the hilt of the Master Sword. And then we had a little mishap. I'll fix him up later on, but for now I'm going to paint the details onto the shield. While we're working on these tiny little details, it's time to do the eyes. This is always the most fiddly part, but if you do it right, it really pays off for the final model. And now that they're both done, it was time to start working on the display base. So I mixed up a bit of my sculptor mold recipe and started on a base. The idea being to build this room here in the water temple where you face off with Shadow Link. So we start by piling down a heap of sculptor mold to build up a higher level of this island where the dead tree will show up in the background and be a nice central piece on our display. And while building up this display board, I realized that this piece was probably a little bit too small. I quickly mocked up a bigger base and printed this out using my Ender 3. And a couple of hours later, I had a much bigger base to repeat this process on. I then coated both of these in a layer of PVA glue and sand before spray painting them with a Tamiya Colors sand spray paint. And then printing off, priming and painting this tree that I got from a Kickstarter that I think perfectly represents the dead tree in the background of the battle scene. I superglued the tree down and then surrounded it with a layer of PVA glue and then coated this with sand. I decided to use this over the entire raised area to look like a lighter version of the sand where the water hadn't soaked in and darkened it. And now to hold these guys in place, I'm going to be using a little bit of UV resin. You see, my plan is to do a full resin pour over this entire build, and I'm not entirely sure how my classic cheap super glues will hold up under a resin pour with a weird chemical reaction. So a bit of UV resin that is fully cured should do the trick. And now to prepare for my first major resin pour. I'll be trying to use a cheap packing tape as my border to dam in all of the resin as I pour it over this base to try and maintain the circular shape around the edge. I'm also going to be keeping this in a disposable oven tray because I have a feeling there's going to be some spillage. To try and prevent this as much as possible, I'm going to go around and dam up all of the edges with a fairly thick layer of hot glue, before mixing up the clear epoxy resin. So I need to mix up equal parts of both A and B, mix them up thoroughly for 3 to 5 minutes, and then pour them over the build. From a lot of things I've seen, people are often worried about air bubbles. I'm not too concerned because I think it will just add to the effect of a watery base. Also, this is a fairly thin pour, so I don't think I'm going to have too many issues with that. I just use a coffee stir stick to help spread the rest of the resin around to any of the areas that it hasn't settled in automatically, but this stuff will level out and settle into most of those gaps over time. Something I did notice with the cheap packing tape as a dam, it did kind of suction in around the edges here, giving a not perfectly flush finish, although it's not too noticeable in the final result. And about 24 hours later, that had been given enough time to dry, so it was time to remove all of the protective damming and see whether or not this resin pour turned out. And it looked like it worked out pretty well for me. It's got a nice raised edge with the obvious transparent section that represents the water. It lipped up around the edges, as I've seen happen a lot with resin pours, but this can be easily cut away. Alright, so now we have these guys in a nice solid layer. We're going to clean up the edges with a scalpel before adding in some watery ripples. We're going to do this using a gloss Mod Podge, some straws, and a good old lung power. You see, once we've coated all of the water areas in a nice thick layer of Mod Podge, we're going to blow through these straws and really give it this nice, natural, random ripples. I'm then going to come in and really focus around the feet areas to show that the water's splashing away as Link and Shadow Link step through the shallows. And after about a day, that dries nice and clear, giving us this beautiful, natural, rippled water look. The way that the light bounces off this and through it really adds that element of water. So we're just going to add in a few little splashes around the feet of our two heroes, and then come in with a little wipe of an alcohol rub to just remove any of the excess of this. And really using this opportunity to try and add back in the elements of those ripples coming out from the feet. And now it wouldn't be a build of mine if I didn't include one of these tiny little frogs. So I snuck him in the back here behind the tree. While this is a little bit less overgrown and colourful than my usual builds, it was a lot of fun playing around with the resin build and taking an idea like the mirrored models and playing around with an art concept like this. I'm pretty happy with this build. I kind of wish that I'd gone with the smaller model frame in the end because there's a lot of dead space, but this was a perfect way to experiment with pouring of resin and making these nice rippled top effects. Having the extra space really let me play with something a little bit more, whereas if I'd used the smaller piece, which probably would have looked better for this final diorama, it wouldn't have given me the same play and ability to learn as much as I did while making this piece here. So all in all, it was a good experimental piece, and it's turned out as a pretty cool piece to throw on the shelf. I'm having a lot of fun with these nostalgic video game builds, and if there's any old games that you'd like to see put down in miniature form, let me know in the comments below. Until then, never stop making stuff.